You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Jeff Lenard with NACS, and today we're going to talk about a topic that is fairly out there in the news, and it's skimming. The whole idea with skimming is, even if it's not happening in your area or in your community, we want to tell everybody how to keep it top of mind, because there are other folks out there in other industries that are keeping it top of mind, and we want to make sure that we are the ones that are guiding the decisions for how we move forward to address this problem. So today, as we talk about skimming, we have two folks here that are really experts in how to address it and what is going on. So please welcome first Paige Anderson, Director of Government Relations at NACS.
It's great to be here, Jeff.
And also Linda Toth, Director of Standards at Connexus.
Hi, Jeff. Great to be here.
So thank you guys for being here. And you guys are much more on the front lines in hearing about what's going on with skimming. So Paige, we'll start with, what are we hearing at the regulatory level related to how they think they might look at the whole idea of skimming?
Well, the one thing that's clear from a governmental standpoint, whether it be state, local, or federal government officials, is they're trying to wrap their head around what exactly is skimming. Unfortunately, they use terms, shimmy, shammy, skimming, what the heck are we talking about? And our first part of the discussion always has to be, what do we mean by skimming? And Linda, you've had to answer that question a lot. So why don't we start with that? What do we mean by skimming?
Sure. So skimming is the method by which they can get the card data. So what they're interested in is getting the magnetic stripe card data so that they can create a counterfeit card and use that in other places, whether they go back to a convenience store to get fuel or whether they use it online in a card not present fraud. And EMV is coming along pretty quick. As we know, we have a 2020 deadline for our outdoor dispensers. So that window for the thieves to get this data is closing. And that's what's prompting skimming to be in the news, because it's becoming more prevalent as that window closes.
And meaning opportunity window.
Absolutely.
And so cards will they will have a chip. And that is something that's much harder to replicate than a magnetic stripe. And so that's the key window that exists right now.
Absolutely. And so today our dispensers are still taking that magnetic stripe data. In the future, in 2020 and beyond, they'll be moving towards EMV, so that'll utilize that chip capability.
And one of the first regulatory or law enforcement bodies that really started seeing these skimming devices was the local state weights and measures officials. They go in and have to inspect our gas dispensers and making sure all of our equipment is working properly and measuring accurately our fuels. And they were noticing these skimming devices and had no idea what they were. And they would contact, the retailers weren't sure what they were, and local law enforcement certainly didn't know what these devices were. And this was several years ago. So really it was the weights and measures folks that really were the first ones to see these devices and trying to figure out what it was. And so that's sort of been the first regulatory body that took notice of this. And certainly states like Florida, Arizona, and Michigan, for whatever reason, those tended to be the hot spots for finding skimming devices. And they were really on the front lines first, although every state, every city could potentially be a victim of skimming and certainly has to be vigilant. But that's where we were seeing it first.
And Connexus has put out a lot of great information about what to do with a skimmer. It started with ATMs, but what's the type of information that you're providing to retailers or suppliers or even the general public to let them know, here's how you can play a role?
So what we do is we have a number of resources on how to prevent skimming. We don't do recommendations on what to do if you find a skimmer. That's really up to, your store needs to have a policy in place, and the time to figure that out is not when you find one. You want to know who to contact and have that policy in place. But what Connexus has done is put together a series of webinars and white papers on how to prevent skimming. Some very easy things you can do, and then some more expensive, complicated things you can do. We think security is not a one and done. It's not a one size fits all. And it's really much more of a layered approach. So if you're very close to an active highway, if you're in one of the areas that sees a lot of skimming, you may do something completely different than your counterpart in another state. But you can use these resources to kind of, figure out what makes sense for me, what can I afford, and what risk do I want to minimize.
That's a great way of thinking about it, because we use the phrase "one size fits all" is not often a very good approach. And I think a lot of times people are thinking the difference between a smaller chain and a larger chain. But thinking about location and how much you might be susceptible, whether it's a state or how the proximity to a highway. I remember a few years ago when we were working early on with the fresh movement with United Fresh Produce Association, we had a checklist, and instead of having these massive documents, and I'll write more than I ought to, but somebody distilled it to a checklist. Are you fit for fresh? And it was simply answer these 8 questions. And some of them were things like, if you sell coffee, a lot of coffee, the customer is sending you a queue that might be ready to sell a little bit more in the way of fresh. Linda, is there any sort of checklist, and I'm just making it up on the spot, but a few things that you might be a little bit more vigilant if this exists or this exists or this exists? Is there a couple things that you might look at? Yeah, so there's a couple of resources out on our website, some couple quick 2-pagers of just some bullet point lists of here's some things you can do. It ranges from, make sure you have good video surveillance or use like the We Care labels. But if you use the We Care labels, you need to check those serial numbers. It's not enough just to put them on. If you're in a higher risk location, you may want to consider something that shuts down your dispenser if the door is opened. So you can look at those. Paige, however, is actually working on some things in conjunction with Weights and Measures. We've been really active with Weights and Measures, and Paige sits on the Skimming task force. And so I'll let her explain some of the education work that we're doing with that.
The Weights and Measures folks, as I said before, were the first ones to see these devices, and they were trying to figure out, are there some basic user requirements or minimum things that retailers should be doing with their equipment? And they're sort of centering around looking at requiring retailers to change the universal locks. A lot of folks don't realize is gas dispensers, when you put them in, those locking devices, you can use the same key in Iowa, Alabama, Texas. So making sure that folks change out their locks and make sure that they're unique is one basic security requirement that retailers should be doing. But they also wanted in the user requirements to make sure that there was lots of optionality, and as Linda said, use a layered security approach, that you don't want to just go to the minimum standard. So things like alarming devices. If there is unauthorized access to those gas dispensers, an alarm could go off, automatic shutdown. There's all sorts of security technology out there that retailers can look at to see if that fits their threat assessment and work on reducing the risk of skimming. They also wanted to take into account the fact that there are things like we are transitioning to EMV. Eventually, we will be moving to mobile commerce and other types of payment systems, and we don't want the requirements to become obsolete. So making sure that's top of mind. But regardless of what those requirements may be in the future, everyone agrees that education and outreach has to be a part of this. And so doing like this podcast and doing other types of programs, whether it's educating Weights and Measures officials, local law enforcement, state legislators, and our retailers, we all are a part of finding the solution in combating these thieves.
So is it, when we talk about changing the locks, and we've mentioned that in the past, I've talked to reporters about that. How simple is that? Is it a matter of calling a locksmith or going to Home Depot? Or
yeah, it's that simple.
So how does that, if somebody says, I need to change the locks, what can they do right now?
Get a new lock. Go to Home Depot and get a lock, or call a locksmith. It is that easy. And Paige was talking about, so if you change those locks, that prevents the thieves from getting in the dispenser. So what that does is eliminate any inline skimmer, which is very popular. It doesn't prevent like the shimmer, which is where it's actually inserted into the card reader. But if we can lock them out of the dispenser, that's, a good portion of what skimming devices we're actually seeing. So.
And of course, I would imagine you don't get the spare key and stick it in the fake rock by the front door or something like that. That's a bad idea.
And it's a good idea to make sure that if somebody comes in and says, hey, I need your dispenser key because I need to do maintenance, get an ID. Make sure that they're really with the company that, maintains your pumps. It's not a bad thing to get an ID and make sure that you have a security log in your store and force them to sign in who they are, what time they came in, and what work they were doing.
And that goes back to the old NACS tech days when we'd have meetings and we'd have people talk about how easy it is to break in your system to get access to passwords and all the simple things somebody can say, hey, so-and-so's out to lunch and I'm here and I need to check this. Or people who stick passwords, you see it all the time on the computer, and all you got to do is walk in and you got this. So treat the dispensers the way you treat anything else that you want secure, and manage it that way, because as we've said in talking to reporters, nobody wants to be skimmed, because if you have been skimmed and it makes the news, well, first off, it's bad for business because you want to do the right thing, but people remember, and they will possibly not want to go to your store on as regular a basis if they're concerned that something other than an awesome experience might happen there.
Jeff, you bring up a good point. As a retailer, you need to make security top of mind. It needs to be part of your corporate DNA. The first thing you think of when you wake up in the morning is, how can I keep my stores as safe as possible, and for the consumer, making sure their payment systems are as safe as possible. That's just the right thing to do, but it's also good business. And so part of what we're trying to do is to make it top of mind for our retailers, that they're thinking of this constantly, because certainly the thieves are thinking about this day in, day out. They're incredibly sophisticated and smart, and they're going to try and come at us. Every change we make, they're going to try and get around it and come up with something new. So that means our retailers have to be doing the same thing, thinking about it every single day.
It's almost like thinking like a criminal. And that's not necessarily how a retailer thinks. A retailer thinks how to delight the customer, but how do you think like a criminal? What if this leads to this, and how do you maybe find time to do that? Not a lot of people have time for that running their business, but it's important to look at the resources that are available at Connexus and NACS and elsewhere they can help you think like a criminal. Not that we are criminals, but we can do those what if scenarios and play through. And you had mentioned, Linda, the 2020 deadline. Will that essentially eliminate skimming, or will that just change the conversation to something else?
I think it's going to change the conversation to something else. EMV is much harder to skim, to counterfeit, but the thieves are working on it. So, chances are they'll come up with something. We have heard a few reports of some shimming that has been successful. EMV again is one approach. And really the layered approach is best. So consider point-to-point encryption and tokenization. If the value of the data that they're getting is meaningless, then there's no point in them getting it. So not only make it harder to get the data, but devalue the data.
And one thing we need to think about, as vigilant as, our retailers are and are trying to be, the fact of the matter is, it's not 100% perfect. So there is the chance that, yes, data is going to be stolen through these skimming devices. So what do we do after the fact? And one thing law enforcement is really encouraging our folks to do is to make sure that our dispensers are well lit and that there's good security cameras in place, so that if the worst case scenario happens and they're able to steal this data through a skimming device, that they can go try and track down those thieves.
And also make sure that the video cameras are upgraded. Paige and I were talking with the Las Vegas Police Department, and they had some video footage of actual when they were installing the skimmers, but the video quality was so poor they couldn't use it. And, with today's technology, you can buy some really good video recording equipment for not all that much money. So make sure it's updated.
Are there any policies related to how long somebody might want to hold on to it, or will that be a mandate down the road? I saw something recently where police departments bought these body cameras. That's become more and more popular. They're relatively cheap, but what they were finding is the ability to store video for 90 days was way, way more expensive than they thought. And they weren't really sure how to, in many cases, when you're looking at a 5-person police department, how do you manage all that? And I would imagine some of the same questions arise with convenience stores. How long do you hold on to stuff? What level of quality? Has there been any discussion that you've heard where people have either advice or looking at potential mandates for how long you must hold information or
We haven't seen anything on the regulatory side making those requirements other than doing your best to have that type of equipment. And it's certainly a recommendation by local law enforcement. So that's a new one. Where we are getting where laws are becoming at cross purposes is, let's say law enforcement takes the skimming device and has that device, but at the same token, the retailer is required to notify the consumer that in fact their information's been stolen, and they don't have access to get that information, so they're not exactly sure. And sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect on notifying the consumer those types of requirements and doing the law enforcement investigative side of when they hold that equipment. That's where we're seeing some confusion, and there needs to be a better connect, but not specifically on the quality and how long you need to hold video.
So that's interesting. So what we're talking about is if there were to be something, it's like Jeff's gas station had an incident with a skimmer. Now I need to find Paige and tell you, but there's no way to do that directly. It has to be through a card company or something like that. But if the mandate exists, that might lead to something like, well, you have to have a full page ad in a newspaper or somewhere else or a billboard or something like that.
And it becomes so vague, you're not exactly sure who you're talking about. And consumers become numb to those announcements because, I wasn't there, so it's probably not me, but it very well may have been them.
Well, and in the case of skimming, when you find a skimmer, you have no way to know how long it's been there. It could have been there an hour. It could have been there a year. So,
and that goes to retailers really need to encourage their employees to look and really make sure that they're opening and checking their equipment, not just a daily basis, perhaps, if it's really busy, multiple times in a day, and really seeing what's inside their devices and doing that inspection and checking.
And skimmers can be hard to detect because they're very small. There's a lot of cabling inside the dispensers. We recommend taking a picture. A picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Take a before picture so that if you see something that looks unusual, you can compare it.
Yeah, I finally learned that doing home repairs and putting in a new ceiling fan. And afterwards, somebody said, so you took a picture beforehand so you knew what the wiring would look like after, right? And no, that's why everything's hanging down. We're calling an electrician. So thinking about, that's a great idea, because what is the before and after? And it's much easier to say this has existed here for a certain amount of time. It's almost like take a picture 8 o'clock in the morning, whatever designated time. When you open the dispenser, log it at that time. It's much easier to go back and say, okay, this is something we need to address from this point forward. Yeah, I like that. That's some pretty good advice you can do right now.
Yes. And that's the thing is, it doesn't matter if you're a single store operator or a large operation with hundreds of stores. There is something for everybody. Everybody can do their part to try and reduce the risk to our consumers.
So anything, we haven't talked about what anybody that's a consumer, that what might be something that somebody could say, hey, that might be worth alerting somebody because it doesn't look like something's right. What might you see? I know skimmers can be installed in a matter of minutes, maybe even less time than that. But what might be something that somebody would say, hey, somebody really needs to know this doesn't feel right?
So typically, like an inline skimmer, a consumer's not going to notice. But if there's an overlay on a pin pad, for example, or if there is an overlay on the card reader, it might be a little bit loose. so you can always wiggle it. That's not guaranteed because, especially with 3D printers, things are, really look solid. But it will look different. Like it might be covering up part of a logo if you look at it from the side. It's going to look a little bit different. And if
might look newer than the rest of the equipment.
It might. I mean, there might be a little bit of difference in color. It's going to stick out farther potentially. It might cover up some lights on an indoor terminal. It might cover up the lights when they're ready, or the little holder for the stylus. So if something doesn't look right, just point it out.
And so I would imagine those overlays are probably the easiest to install and probably the least suspicious. Then you get to the one where it's, you use the phrase inline, I guess, that would be it, where you have to open the dispenser door. So I would assume opening a dispenser door is the first thing that somebody would say, oh, that looks, whether it's a crowbar or whether it's a key, that might be something where you go inside the store.
If there's scratches, or if something's bent and it looks like somebody was trying to open it, there's a good chance maybe they did.
So what next? I know we have more weights and measures meetings. There's other discussions with law enforcement about how do we look at this. I know one of the key things is from our industry side, conversations really matter. And having as many conversations with folks who do have a stake in this is making a difference in talking to groups like law enforcement and saying, here's how we can work together to both communicate. I know Texas Association has a great video showing what you can do. NACS has some great resources. What are you seeing over the next few months, Paige?
Well, as Linda said, I'm heading up the education subgroup for weights and measures, and we're going to be bringing together retailers, private sector, technology and security folks, law enforcement, and weights and measures officials, and sort of take our show on the road and coming up with the great materials like NACS and Connexus has prepared, and being able to get that information out, but also working with our state associations especially, where we can create dialogue, whether it's a working group or an education session or a workshop, where we bring all those players in the same room and being able to ask those questions, especially somebody who may be new to the industry and is getting their operation up and setting up to be able to offer all the great products our convenience industry does, but making sure that when they do that, they're taking into account the security measures. And if we can start that education process early, we think that's a good thing. So I think what you're going to see are a lot more workshops of bringing industry, law enforcement, and regulators together, because we have to solve this problem together.
Anything you're seeing, Linda? Any in working groups and talking through at Connexus, whether it's at your annual meeting or other meetings?
Yeah, so we have a data security committee that meets on a regular basis. We also have an annual conference that's coming up April 28th through May 2nd in Nashville this year. Our website, connexus.org, it's CONEXXUS.org. If you go out there and click on the resource tab, there's a lot of public resources. As I mentioned, the white papers, there's pre-recorded webinars. So yeah, we've got a lot of great information.
Well, thank you. And also, don't forget NACS, convenience.org/skimming has more resources and links to Connexus and others. So it's a topic we're going to stay on top of. We really appreciate Linda and Paige joining us today to fill us in a little bit more on what you can do. So, and thank you for listening to Convenience Matters.
Thanks.
Happy to be here, and we'll be back.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.